Oh, it's transcribing. That's hilarious. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
Oh dear. I'm gonna turn that on.
I'm consenting,
Oh, you're consenting. Okay, cool.
apparently, by attending.
All right, yeah, you are. You're what was it? Passive consent. Right. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox, episode 8. God, I went into major then and into minor, and the end was rather macabre. Quite like that. I might develop that. So welcome to Gareth's Inbox. Gareth's Wimbox. Gareth's Winbox, episode 8. I'm sorry about the long delay. For those of you who've been itching to hear the next episode of Gareth's Winbox. Sorry about the long delay from the last one. I have no excuses. But health and time. But Gareth's Winbox is back, and I hope to be producing more regularly from now on. Probably maybe once a week, once every couple of weeks, probably once every couple of weeks. But I really enjoyed the last episode with Sam and talking about metal, and I hope you enjoyed that too. But this week, we're going to be talking about the general theme of diagnosis and diagnoses, and that it is our word of the day. Diagnosis, from my ever helpful Chamber Dictionary of Etymology. Diagnosis. 1681, New Latin from Greek diagnosis, a discerning, distinguishing from diagnoskein, discern, distinguish. Dia, Greek, apart, and gignoskein, learn, to know. So apart, to know apart. Diagnostics was used in 1621, borrowed from the French diagnostic, from the Greek diagnostikos, able to distinguish, from diagnostos, to be distinguished, from diagnoskein, distinguish. So diagnosis, from dia, apart, and gignoskein, learn. So let's turn to the ever-reliable Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, Volume 1, A to Mark Worthy, to look at diagnosis here. Diagnosis. Again, the Greek words, which they give in the original Greek, which I'm not going to read, but again, dia, distinguish, discern, dia, and perceive. Medicine, determination of the nature of a diseased condition, identification of a disease by investigation of its symptoms and history. Also, the formal statement of this, distinctive characterization in precise terms. Some uses they used are diagnosis of the character of a person from 1868, and the genera Piscium contains well-defined diagnoses of 45 genera from 1880. So diagnosis is our word of today. So diagnosis is a very fascinating word and contains within itself the apart and to know, apart to know. So almost being apart from yourself, but then also knowing yourself. The apart being perhaps the external definition, which then enables a knowledge of self. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about diagnosis, and I have a special guest that I'm going to introduce you to in a few seconds. So welcome to Gareth's Winbox, episode 8, Diagnoses. Imagine you're going off to in the UK, we've got such a thing called the blue badge, which the blue badge is something you can get to give you access to disability, to disabled parking spaces that we see outside of supermarkets and things like that. And a person I know recently applied for a blue badge for disabled persons. And they went through the scheme themselves, and they, with their diagnosis that they had from their GP, they went through this process and they sent off, and their diagnosis was for a hidden disability, in inverted commas. The blue badge people at the council wrote back with that they needed some more information. And this was an information form that was sent to health and social care professionals. And essentially, this person who's applied for a blue badge has now to defer their disability to an external agent to validate that their disability is enduring, i.e. lasts for 3 years or more, which is the blue badge cutoff point, and which is disabling enough to enable them to get a blue badge. Now, my friend was very curious about this, in the fact that they had a disability from an agency, i.e. a medical agency, about their, in inverted commas, hidden disability. But that diagnosis, that formal diagnosis via medicine and via the agents of medicine, isn't enough, and that they have to get more external validation for their disability to be considered enduring. Now, that is just a little anecdote which I thought was interesting to inaugurate, really, a discussion I'm going to have today about diagnoses. Now, what does it mean? I think some of the things we're going to talk about today is, what does it mean to be diagnosed with or of something? Can we diagnose ourselves? Or does diagnosis have to be something sanctioned by authority? Or can it be both? Does diagnosis give us agency, or does it rob us of agency, i.e. deferring, as I was suggesting with the blue badge thing, to an external agency? Giving over to a diagnosis, that is to an external or linguistic or discursive agency to determine in large parts our being disabled, might be to become, we might say, alien to ourselves, or at the very least to consolidate a sense of being alien to a society, and then to try to work out kind of retrospectively what constitutes this alienness. But is it an inalienable right? If an inalienable right is something that cannot be restrained or repeated or repealed by law, what might it mean? What might alienable rights be? What it might be to reclaim alienableness. We're going to come back to this. This is a thing. But diagnosis is a paradoxical. Diagnosis, what we're talking about today, is a paradoxical, complex, and it's kind of a grubby process. As Devin Price, or Dr. Devin Price, as he's referred to in his book Unmasking Autism, talks about, he goes through the journey. This is book 2022. He talks about diagnosis very, very brilliantly in his book Unmasking Autism. And he sort of says, one of the things he asks people when they reach out to him to say, I think I might be autistic, I think I might be have ADHD. He asks this question: what do you hope to get out of being formally diagnosed? And he says, on page 42, it can come with some serious social legal benefits under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He's writing from the US, as well as under anti-discrimination statuses worldwide. He says you might, after you get diagnosed, hope that people will take your problems more seriously. Formal diagnosis means you might receive disability accommodations at school or work. It might qualify you, in the States at least, alas, for medical marijuana, or for a therapy animal, which to me sounds glorious. Family members, he says, have told you that you're whiny and lazy, might finally get off your case when they realize you have a developmental disorder. A therapist or medical care provider may tailor their treatment for you. So these are the positives. But he goes on to say, unfortunately, a diagnosis is not a guarantee that you'll receive any of these benefits. So, for example, he says, proving in a court of law that you've been discriminated against as an autistic person in particular requires extensive documentation. Even though you might be theoretically, your diagnosis might enable you to have accommodations on paper, many employees and educators refuse to provide them, or actually mistreat the employees and students who request them. He also says about family, as much as I'd like to promise that being recognized formally as autistic will get judgmental friends and family off your back, I've heard, he says, too many counterexamples to claim that is really the case. Your family members, he says, might find your disability even more threatening once it's validated by a doctor, or they might use your diagnosis to undermine your judgment or infantilize you. And he concludes, this isn't intended to dissuade you from seeking a diagnosis. I just don't want, he says, anyone to have the impression that a piece of paper signed by a psychiatrist magically unlocks a suite of resources and social respect. End quotation. That's from page 42 and 43 of Unmasking Autism. Now, Devin Price's outline there of the complexities and paradoxes and messiness of diagnosis is something I want to talk about today. And I have a very special guest to talk about this, which is Eva Aldea, who's a friend of mine. And she's here with me today. Hello. Hello, Eva. Hello. Welcome. You're talking to me from Sweden, is that right?
I am. I'm in Stockholm.
In Stockholm.
Special appearance from Stockholm.
Special appearance from Stockholm. Now, my long-winded and really garbled introduction to diagnosis is essentially some of the ideas we're going to talk about today. But well, Eva, perhaps you can introduce yourself to us, to the Gareth Whim audience.
Hello, audience. I'm Eva. I'm a writer, also a teacher, a lecturer in English Lit and soon creative writing, an editor, a general wordsmith. And I am someone also who has quite recently received a diagnosis of ADHD. So lots of interesting things. And of course, I'm also the co-editor on a project with you, Gareth, which is explicitly about diagnosis and writing.
Yeah, so, excuse me, Eva and I are going to working on, and we've just put out a call for abstracts for a thing we're calling DX, or Diagnosis and Writing. Eva very brilliantly writes in the abstract to the website. A diagnosis, she writes, is always differential, is an act of recognition and otherness. To seek, to receive, to identify with a diagnosis is deeply personal and inevitably political, affecting our relationships with ourselves, others, our surroundings, and our place in society. And one of the things that we are asking is how, in particular, and what we're interested in this project, is how does it affect our relationship with writing? And we're going to go on to talk a little bit later about the ways in which diagnosis and all of the complexities that I outlined at the beginning would impact on, in particular, the formal dynamics of writing, stylistic dynamics of writing, but also perhaps change or transform a writer's understanding of their own writers. But just to go back to the first parts, I was going to ask you, Eva, diagnosis is always differential, you write. It's an act of recognition and otherness. To seek, to receive identity with a diagnosis is deeply personal. So I'll stop there because we'll talk about perhaps the political dimensions. Now, if you want, perhaps you can tell us about what led to this project, but also perhaps more recently, like about your own diagnosis.
Yeah, so interestingly, they're kind of enmeshed. I don't think so. One happened alongside the other. Actually, the project came first. I think the sort of seed was sown to it when I was doing an MFA, just started a couple of years ago and finished last year. And some people in the group were really interestingly writing. They weren't writing just about their diagnosis, but kind of through and with. And this was both sort of physical chronic illness, that sort of thing, and mental health diagnoses. And I had some really good conversations with some people about how both the condition and the treatment for conditions really affected their writing. I mean, literally on the stylistic level, of the way they thought, and therefore the way they wrote actually changed. So that's something I found really interesting at the time and sort of was just fascinated with on a personal level. And then actually the idea of taking it further was when I read Cuff, which is Gareth's excellent collection, written about but also from and with autism. And again, I thought, oh, here's someone with a diagnosis of neurodivergence who's doing something like this, who's clearly working through a diagnosis and kind of allowing the diagnosis to work through their writing, I guess. If that, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm kind of analysing
Well, I was
your
sort of
writing.
trying to work it out while I was doing it. So yeah, it's a good that then still am.
Yeah. But so that's interesting. So it's not just about this diagnosis and writing project is not just about saying, oh, how does the diagnosis affect your writing, but also how does writing allow you to work through a diagnosis, whether that's in terms of understanding or in terms of some kind of therapeutic aspect, or writing back towards diagnosis, writing against diagnosis, and also the way obviously diagnoses are seen in society, which we maybe get to, and how writing can mediate that. So that was when I started thinking about this, and we had some conversation and kind of decided to do this project. And I think that was at the time where this was like about a year ago, and probably just before that, 6 months before that, I started to have chats with my doctor about the fact that some of the things I was experiencing mental health wise might be related to neurodivergence, ADHD in particular. And this is like the anecdote is that I think you said, because my mother had also been diagnosed with autism at the ripe old age of 77. It's never too late. And you kind of said something about it running in families. And I was like, no. I might have some some symptoms, but no. It was such a journey in the last 2 years, kind of changing my thinking. And so the project and having conversations with you and other people with neurodivergence and kind of reading up on it, especially since my mother was diagnosed, becoming really aware of it, led then finally to me seeking assessment for it. So it's interesting because the project is sort of very much implicated in it. I'd kind of seen it as being an editor and seeing it from outside, but suddenly I find myself in it. So yeah, that was kind of the beginnings of the project.
Well, we'll talk about the project in a minute, but what were you diagnosed for, and what you were diagnosed with, and what did you go into the process thinking that you would be diagnosed with?
Yeah, so interestingly, that actually ended up fitting quite well, because so I'd suggested to my psychiatrist that I might be ADHD, and she had said rather cryptically, yes, but there's probably other stuff going on as well. And so she suggested that I'd go for a full assessment for ADHD and autism, which in itself is problematic because that's the total neurodivergence assessment you can get. There's no sort of, it's just those two. That's quite a dualistic system, right? You either have the two
horsemen of the neuroapocalypse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Although as far as I understand, the thinking is that there are, thinking is that OCD, bipolar, etc., is also coming under the neurodivergence umbrella. But anyway, the assessment very much. And there was, I went through quite a lot of testing, and as you might well know, and the results came back kind of as I expected, and that is, yes, you're definitely ADHD, but you're not autistic, but with autistic traits, the ADHD with autistic traits. And that was interesting, and that actually the assessing psychiatrist was lovely, and very, very interesting, and she was very open about the fact that assessment is a very crude instrument, that we're only at the beginning of talking about neurodivergence and understanding neurodivergence, and she was sort of said, well, a diagnosis, and I think that I'd like to hear your opinion about this. A diagnosis for her in her profession is when you fulfill a certain amount of criteria. So there's basically a tick boxing exercise, and sort of, if you tick enough boxes, then you get a diagnosis. But not only that, the diagnosis for them is if you are disadvantaged by your condition. If the condition is a disorder, if you have enough symptoms, tick enough boxes for the the powers to be to believe that you have a disorder. So in that way, you look at my diagnosis and say, okay, so I have enough ADHD traits for them to say, yes, you have a disorder, you have somehow been disadvantaged, whatever that means by that. You also have you've also ticked some boxes in the autism, but not enough to be disadvantaged. So that there you don't get a diagnosis. I thought that was really fascinating and kind of disturbing as well, in terms of, because that went from having started to self-identify as neurodivergent to being told that I have a disorder, which, inevitably it's just, when someone in authority says, let it be so, I now pronounce you ADHD. It is something else. It's something different than even if you knew.
Yeah, I mean, Devin Price in Unmasking Autism and elsewhere in his lots of platforms, and he does brilliant work on this. He writes about it. Writes about it's about threshold standards, and you reach these certain thresholds, but actually it's a very, very strange process, in that essentially you can see lots of people are self-diagnosing, which is perfectly legit, and actually many people don't have, of course, who am I to say that, but self diagnosis is a thing, and actually people get a lot of joy out of that. But actually then one ends up chasing a diagnosis that is recognized by particular standards, the standards against which you actually stand in other ways, in the sense that you don't want to defer to an authority to tell you have something, but somehow there's a sort of sticker of validity, but which then sort of, what do you do with that? You can say actually autistic or actually ADHD. You can embrace that as a term of time, but also it's very exclusionary, and it's also dependent upon the authorities to tell you are that thing. You are that thing, and so in a way it's exclusionary to people that are on the threshold or in between or what have you. And it's also, it doesn't really. It's a very crude metric as well. Very crude metric of measurement. And also a lot of the and a lot of that is to do with it's an evolving field, as it were. Obviously, as many of you know, autism used to be just like the little white boys, who were little professors, as Asperger's called them. Certainly girls, black, brown, and others were, they were just eccentric and or just being women. And so the diagnostics criteria is that. Also, I didn't. Did you tell me that you had to arrange things into a story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had to. Yes. I had to tell a story around things. To tell a story from a book. I also have to pretend to brush my teeth.
Yeah.
With imaginary toothbrushes.
Yeah, and these things, Devin Price writes about this very brilliantly. I mean, that was designed to diagnose autism in children.
I know.
And the inadequacy is like, you wouldn't expect an autistic adult to act like you wouldn't expect an adult to act like a child. So why do you expect an autistic adult to act like an autistic child? And it just goes to show the crudity of the ways in which these things are diagnosed. Nevertheless, and also the other thing as well is that there is very, very strong evidence of genetic and familial profiles, but that it's not entirely clear whether it's directly related to a particular people in a family, or whether it's some sort of genetic cluster that then creates, eventually creates an autistic person, as it were, or an ADHD person with ADHD.
I mean, interestingly, I spoke to my auntie yesterday, and talking about my mother and her diagnosis, and I mean, looking at that side of the family, so that's my mother's sister. She's clearly ADHD. I mean, I'm diagnosing her, but she has many. My auntie and I are very similar. But her daughter, my cousin, is very much like my mother, has more autistic traits. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, is that some kind of, what is it? Who did the P's, the recessive traits and the I mean, the genetics of it is just too complicated.
And again, I mean, as I said at the beginning before we were speaking, neither you nor I are experts on these, and I would in my program notes to this I will put reference to Devin Price's work and other I'll put a bibliography, because these people are way more steeped in these things than you or I am, but I'm interested in this. Before we go on to talk about the project, I'm interested in what you said about being like, do you feel like, I'm going to ask you a direct question, do you feel let down by not being, or slightly disappointed by not being diagnosed with autism, or as
so
autistic, I should say?
Bizarrely, yes. And I can see, I look at that myself and go, why? What is that? Is that because I want to be in that club as well? It's basically I've got a ticket to one club but not the other. Yeah, and it's ridiculous, because I mean, I'm not surprised at all at the, I can look at myself and say, no, I do certainly not. If we say diagnosis is the threshold of diagnosis is impairment, then there is no way on earth that I would pass that. But yeah. So as you said, there is something validating about that. I think mainly. So I wonder how much that's got to do with the community that is now springing up around neurodivergence and wanting to be part of that and sort of having a validation. I think my sense about that with autism is probably more to do with that. Whereas being diagnosed with ADHD, on one hand, made me feel really, really relieved, because I knew I could have access to treatment, and also, well, actually, that goes with all of it. Mainly find a therapist who could recognise that, because I've had therapy for many, many years, and it's been extremely helpful, and obviously it got me through a lot of things. But there were things that always bothered me, and I can see that that's related. So to me, that was like a relief that I can now go forward and say, you can help me in this way. But interestingly, that's still something we have to do, is we have to go forward and say, you can help me in this way, because people don't, it's not obvious. As Devin Price says, like it doesn't magically open some kind of doors of into a new, easier life, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, that sense of it's feeling, perhaps to be crass about it, like feeling like an alien as you're growing up, then being told you are an alien, and then like go and discover why you're an alien, and so then you find other aliens, and there's a lot of to crudely extend this metaphor, there are a lot of auti aliens around, and with very strong voices and doing great things, and you can but of course there's so much divergence under those umbrellas. But one thing you were saying before we started recording really was the sense in which you felt that was much more, in your experience at least, much more solidified as an autistic community than an ADHD community. And what is that? Can you expand
I don't know
on
if it's, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. Maybe it's just kind of the way my research or whatever, my Twitter feed is curated. I don't know, but it feels like there is more coalescence in terms of the community or autism. That autism also has become more of a recognized neurodivergence, which almost to the extent that if someone says I'm neurodivergent, people will assume it's autism. I don't know if that's correct. But also just professionally haven't been interested in writing, and there's quite a lot of stuff about autistic writers, and there's sort of literary criticism dealing with the topic now. But I can't find any books that sort of about ADHD, particularly about ADHD and writing. I'm sure it's sort of mentioned within some of the stuff on neurodivergence.
I mean, I think that's what I said before. I think a lot of great work is being done, both in the social sciences, literature, humanities, etc. And we'll talk about this at the end of this podcasting discussion I'm very interested in. I'm quite excited to talk about it, but I'm going to leave it there. But under the umbrella of neurodivergence, and I think that, and of course there is a category ADHD, is that right? Is that
yeah, I've seen that, yeah.
Which seems to me to be quite great,
which is really cool as well. And I'm like, well, if I had been also, that's also the validation, right? If I'd got the diagnosis of autistic, I could be an ADHD.
Yeah, but you could theoretically, you could, not theoretically, actually, practically, you could do that anyway.
Yeah.
Because of just what we said about the, but there is something about, this is what I'm saying, this is what I think I went through my own paradoxes about, is that there is something like, it's like wanting a badge without wanting a badge. Like, that is to say, it's like, hey, I'm disabled, which is what it is. I'm disordered. Hey, like that. I now have my, and then you're like, well, yeah, okay, well, now what? Does that mean that people that aren't diagnosed, who have autistic traits, who have traits of ADHD, are less valid or valuable? No, of course it doesn't.
No.
But there is something. There's a sort of bad faith surrounding a lot of diagnoses, I think, which is sort of that you want it, but because it makes you feel part of a club. But then, like, being part of that club, to all intents and purposes, when I still tell people, the normies, when I'm walking around, or I'm autistic, they look at me as if I've just sort of told them that I'm, I don't know, going to blow up the church or something. It's like or like a look of horror, like they don't know what you're going to do, or they say to you, no, you're not.
Yeah, like, I mean, I was just going to ask, surely you must get but you don't look autistic.
You don't look autistic, and we're all a little bit autistic. Now, before I read Devin Price's book, this notion we're all a little bit autistic. My response to that was, yeah, because we're all a little bit human. Of course we're all humans. He actually is a lot more forgiving about this phrase, we're all autistic, because he sort of says, well, we kind of are, but then there are thresholds. Like, so for example, the thing about autism, and my autism in particular, and others, and obviously we can't extrapolate from one person to another, it affects all of my life. Like, and I can't step out of it, sometimes in very debilitating ways, which goes back to what you were saying about if it has a profound impact on your life. It's like the definition in medicine between chronic and what's the other term, chronic and or something, so if something's chronic, it's there all the time.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that term in the blue badge thing that I was anecdotalizing.
I was just going to bring
enduring.
Up, it's the threshold of sort of enduring disability, disadvantage.
Yeah, and Devin Price is quite right in that my prickling about that is because I felt diminished by that. It's like someone's diminishing the fact that it does impact on me in quite profound ways. And effectively what they're saying is there's a fine line between, oh, we're all a little bit autistic, and like we all get a little bit stressed. But it's like in Pete Wharmby's book, Untypical, he says actually a lot of autistic people are really on the precipice of being stressed all the time. And of course we so everyone experiences stress, for example, but this is part of our neurology and it doesn't go away. And so, but actually Devin Price says, yeah, I mean, we're all a little bit autistic, and that's great. And we all share these traits. It's just some people have it much more than others. And I think,
and maybe that's why a diagnosis is useful, however much we want to sort of go around it and how it's authoritative, etc. But that is useful because it is the benchmark at which a condition becomes disabling in some way. Although then we can always, question, why is it disabling and which circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, the notion of the terms disabling, impairment, of course, imply putative norms by which putative norms of ableism, which is, of course, preposterous in and of itself. What is able, and the notions of functioning or high functioning, low functioning, exactly. Which of course are now ridiculous. And some people use those terms, but a lot of people find them ridiculous because one person's functioning is not another person's functioning, etc., etc. But I do want to step into sort of segue towards thinking about writing. But just I know it's early days for you, but right, okay. So we're doing this project, as I said, and I'll put a link to our project. And if anyone wants to contribute, by the way, do email us an abstract for this. But it's early days for you, but how do you reckon your own writing's been affected by?
So someone actually just asked me that.
Was it me just then?
Online. No, it was someone online, someone who was in touch generally, but also had seen the DX project. And so went, well, what about you? And the answer is, I don't know yet. I can see that looking back at it, my difficulty with wanting to write creatively and wanting to write a novel and not being able to do it was because I wanted to write a novel that didn't fit with my brain at all. And I think it took a while to learn that there was other ways of writing. And writing, a novel doesn't have to be what I thought it, and there's many reasons why I thought that. I still think that the first book that is out now,
called Singapore, by the way.
Singapore,
it's just been published
by Holland House Books.
By Holland House Books. Shout out to that.
Yeah, available in all good bookshops. Well, online anyway.
And some rubbish ones.
And rubbish ones, yeah. I think I squeezed that. Actually, certainly squeezed the second version of it into a far more linear shape, where it had all these sort of extras. And looking now at the second book that I'm writing, which is very, very different, but it's extremely fractured and full of these little vignettes that connect in extremely intricate ways. I can't but wonder whether that's, and I'm enjoying writing this way way more than I did writing the first one. And I sort of allow myself to go down rabbit holes of research for each little bit. And I can't but connect that to the way my brain is working. So, I mean, I definitely continue sort of considering that.
Well, it's curious, isn't it? Because the reason I asked that question is because I knew that the question is you perhaps wouldn't know because you haven't worked it out yet. And in a sense, that's what our DX project is about. Is about people thinking about the notion of diagnosis and how, first of all, how it impacts on their understanding of writing. But perhaps there is always going to be a sort of retrospective scrutiny of one's writing practices once one is diagnosed. Like from my own perspective, I've always written what I can now describe because I'm thinking about this quite a lot because I'm writing a book on autistic poetics. As I pretty much write. Let's say I've lent into my autism without realizing it. In the way I write. I mean, just anyone who's read Kerf, there are moments of clarity, but there's kind of lots of cryptic pattern-seeking play with language. It's fragmented, but then it has it has hyper focus on detail and stuff like that. So that's how I've always written. But I went until I was 41, 42, I wouldn't have described it that way. I mean, in fact, I did think quite clearly before any of these diagnoses about pattern seeking and recognition. In fact, it reminded me of again, Devin Price is getting lots of shout outs today because he's great and he's written a great book. He talks about
it is a great book. That book actually was one of the first things I picked up about autism.
I'd recommend it to everyone. It's fantastic. And he's talking about autism, and he's talking about autism is neurological, page 20. Autistic people, he says, and again, forgive me, I'm talking about autistic people here, but of course there's overlaps, have differences in development of their anterior cingulate cortex, a part of the brain that helps regulate attention, decision making, impulse control, and emotional processing. Through our brains, autistic people have delayed and reduced development of von economoneurons, or VEN, brain cells that help with rapid intuitive processes in complex situations. And he goes on to describe what this is. But one of the things he says is autistic brains have unique connection patterns that deviate from what is normally observed in neurotypical people, and autistic people also exhibit less of what neuroscientists call global to local interface. We are inclined to zero in on small details, even when those details don't jibe with the overall big picture. Now, in terms of how it's impacted on me as a writer, those things, when I was always terrible at writing logical essays. I was always what I called pathologically linear in how I wrote essays. So I didn't, for example, I didn't get an A in my GCSE English, my A-level English, which didn't get me into university I wanted to, because I could not work out this global picture. I was much more interested in, and it took me years and years of brutal behavioral intellectual therapy to myself to make me write logically, and also, but also my poetry has always been a way of exploring those patterns that I see in society and culture and in language, subsequently, that I didn't realize was actually me being neurologically autistically attuned to like, let's say, submerged patterns and me messing around with them. So actually, the diagnosis for me has sort of enabled me to sort of retroactively analyze my writing practices in quite a useful way, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. For me, it's been, I guess, the ADHD sort of, the good thing about it is I realized that is what made me good researcher, because of this sort of obsessiveness, following the rabbit down, but also making a lot of lateral connection. And I just started talking about neurons. I feel like I just read something recently. I needed to get up. Just a little article, I think it's in Science, that people who are later diagnosed with ADHD, and I think also some other mental health problems, apparently they don't prune their synaptic connections in teenagehood. Did you see that?
Devin Price writes about that as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so that was recently in the news, I think.
Yeah, we don't prune as well, but we don't know which to prune.
Yeah. So we basically end up with too many connections in our heads, which means we make connections that other people don't, because we still have those pathways open. And I mean, to me, that is like, well, that's really cool. Like, why would I want to prune my synaptic connections? Although obviously, considering it also leads to quite a lot of suffering.
Well, it's like when you're open, you've got open neurons, like open wounds. But Devin Price suggests that what that means is that let's say neurotypical people are much more able to relinquish the things that disable them to function in normative context, and so they can differentiate between what's necessary and what's not, whereas neurodivergent people don't have that ability to differentiate. I would actually argue, on an ethical dimension, I think a lot of autistic people and neurodivergent people, sometimes they don't want to relinquish those things because they know those things are harmful to everyone. That is to say, to normify yourself. What I'm saying is that I think we perhaps pick up on stuff that is good but is not considered to be good in normative society,
or that basically we don't have a filter to certain things, and kind of, I see what you mean. There's certain things that ethically we should pay attention to, but in order to survive, people don't, right?
Yeah, and
those are the things that we find, I think actually particularly autistic people have that sort of strong sense of fairness, and that it becomes really difficult to move away, and that becomes a problem. That's really interesting. It's
not a willing. I've often talked about this in my work. It's not a willing self-harm, but it's a self-harm which is, and I don't mean self-harm to trigger anyone, or it's a form of it's a neurology that within a normative society is harming to yourself, because you cannot not expose yourself. You cannot not be open to these things. You can't prune them away, as it were. You can't get rid of the weeds. But as we all know, like, weeds are just plants, and they're really great plants a lot of the time.
Yeah,
they
it just depends on how you define them, right? It's we just decided we don't like the look of a particular flower.
Yeah.
But they tend to be pretty persistent, which a lot of our traits are. I think in terms of ADHD, just trying to bring myself in, bring me and my ADHD comrades into the neurodivergent discussion about how, what is it that we do. I think as an ADHD person, I'm so utterly open about things. And people are like, oh, okay. And I think that's also like, that's hard, like I can't protect myself.
And that can be you can't, and sometimes you can't protect others as well. That can be challenged to other people, can't it?
Yeah. So, but then, again, it's like, it's not deliberate. And it's certainly difficult to change, if not impossible, right?
I mean, just to sort of dovetail that, really, the next section in your précis, I'll just read it again. A diagnosis is always differential, an act of recognition or otherness. To seek to receive, to identify with a diagnosis is deeply personal. I asked you about that. You continue to say, and inevitably political, affecting our relationships with ourselves, others, and our surroundings. We've talked about that, and our place in society. Like, just the last thing I want to talk about, really, in relation to our project, and again, I'll put a link to this, is this inevitably political. We've touched on it a little bit here. Like, what is the value of diagnosis in, let's say, as a writer, what does a diagnosis enable us to do, which can activate political critique, let's say? Do you think? Are they related? Is that?
Yeah, I think. I mean, let me just start broadly on diagnosis, and it not even just neurodivergence diagnosis, but diagnosis of illness and disability. So this fact that the sort of setting apart of otherness, and the acknowledgement that someone is, again, this term disabled or disadvantaged, is already a question to society of what, if the way that society works is not inclusive, and I guess for a long time that was just sort of, well, there are just some people outside, but now I feel like it is an open question. It's a critique, saying, well, what can we do? It sort of shows up the faults and weaknesses in society, and as such can be political. And with the writing, I guess I really there were some people who responded to our first sort of query about this, with some really interesting sort of political ideas, and I really wanted that to be mentioned, because I'm not entirely clear on how this works, but I know it's there, and I want people to tell me and tell us. I really want to explore that. What do you think?
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about, sort of maybe the ethics, or the ethical dimension of experiencing life for myself as an autistic person, and how that embodiment and that personhood can perhaps be used as an agency of change. But then I'm also thinking about in terms of writing. I suppose, we did say that I was going to say this. So in a piece that I was writing recently about autism and academia, I tried to think about, through critical disability studies, about the notion of neurodivergence as an emancipatory awkwardness. I'll just read a little bit of this. As Dan Goodley argues in Culture Theory and Disability, a book that he wrote, quote, "Disability is the space from which to think through a host of political, theoretical, practical issues relevant to all," end quote. And I say that my piece that I've written is perhaps an attempt to forge this space, to think through these nascent and somewhat inchoate to me issues facing autistic academics. And I talk particularly about higher education, but one of the things, and I talk about how universities need to find solutions for neurodiverse people, and perhaps neurodivergence can be the site from which we critique institutions. So what I say about this talk and my writing about this is that my awkward, and it's a bit of a playful paper, it offered an example of an emancipatory display of what might be called undisciplined cognition, that critiques the ableist ideologies and practices of normative discipline, what it is to be disciplined, what it is to be normally cognitive. again, John Goodley says this: disabled people constitute a huge problem for non-disabled society precisely because they disrupt the normative individual. And after this I say the disabled academic, or let's say the disabled writer, constitutes a huge problem for the academy or the Academy of Letters, precisely because they disrupt the normative model of the professional writer, the normative writer, and the professional academic. And I'll just finish by saying Goodley actually draws on the work of some critical race and disability theorists, as well as the crip theory of Robert McClure, to suggest, quote, the disabled individual queers or crips the normative pitch of the autonomous citizen, end quote. And this is what I finally say. Confronted by what Goodley calls the epistemic invalidation of ableism, perhaps the autistic academic must become, or the autistic writer or the neurodivergent writer must become, in the words of Garland Thompson, intransigence embodied, quote, and this is me, kicking against the pricks of the neoliberal ableist practices and discourses of the Academy or the Academy of Letters. And I say, my talk at my university went largely unnoticed, but perhaps this talk, its deconstructive, cripistemological methodologies expressed through awkwardly autistic discursive tics, might one day be heard. So that's me, my rather garbled articulation of perhaps one of the values of autistic neurodivergent writing.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of critical awkwardness, of using awkwardness as a tool, as a political tool, and make it. You also reference Sarah Ahmed, sort of you paraphrase her, say the autistic. Well, not paraphrase, sort of change. She talks about the feminist killjoy.
Yeah, and I talk about the autist killjoy.
Yeah, and that, what you said is the sort of the disabled body or the disabled mind. Again, I don't like that, but the divergent body and mind, just sort of is a problem, and being a problem, being awkward, is the beginning of a critique. I think there's always something awkward about critique, isn't there? It's not all criticism beginning and sort of going yes, but you're always sort of sticking, you're always poking. I mean, that's
and that's infuriating to managers. I always say and this is I probably said this so many times to you and others, but like every meeting at a university or wherever should say on the door, leave your critique at the door, because it's infuriating if you say yes but to a manager when they've made a decision. That's not what they want to hear. They just want you to say yes, and it's the but which is annoying.
Which is introducing awkwardness, is making the disrupting things. I also really like the idea that there's a lot of overlap between critical critical
disability studies,
disability studies and queer studies, etc.
And critical race studies as well, which is
and critical race studies. I just actually, when you were talking about the disability or illness, chronic illness or mental illness or whatever, is this sort of the body queering itself to a certain extent. The other thing that I am interested in, there is quite a lot of discourse about neurodivergence in particular, but I think other diagnoses as well, as being a site for anti-capitalist movements, which I think is correct. I think that is a possibility. That's a way. Because I was also, you talk about in that essay, you talk about neoliberalism and how it's sort of taking over everything, including academia. And I think the disabled person is always difficult to fit into those, right? But because the disabled person is per se a person who is not productive in the way. And in a sense, the idea of the disadvantage, the disadvantage is someone who cannot function under neoliberal terms, right? Cannot function as a productive member of society. Therefore, you are disadvantaged. That's really what they're saying, because, what's the criteria? A disadvantage to what?
Well, it's curious actually. As you were saying that, I was just thinking about like Elon Musk,
Mm.
and like
Mm.
I was thinking, are there like neo-capitalist autists? And like, yeah, Elon
Yeah.
Musk, and also like, but usually they're white cis dudes, that would have been described as like high-functioning Asperger's people in the past. You know, they're
Yeah, but they're
really good
also
at techie
trotted
stuff.
out. Yeah, and they're also trotted out as, oh, you're neurodivergent. You should be really happy because Elon Musk has got this. So
Yeah,
you can be successful. So that's they're just
yeah,
them being sort of heralded as these, But look, is just saying just because you're disabled or neurodivergent, you can't get a break from capitalism. You still have to you still have to perform because they could perform. Look at how well they
yeah.
perform.
And also, it's disingenuous for me to think that all autistic people are left wing.
That's true.
I don't know what Elon Musk's politics are, but I don't, but it's curious, isn't it? It strikes me that I was reading this article about Niall, the in inverted commas great Niall Ferguson, the historian, who said America is Aspergic in like the 1990s, and like basically he just took, and he basically said everyone uses Asperger's now as an excuse, and it's just like we're all weak and blah blah blah, which I find hilarious. But like you can see how actually autism in particular, or Asperger's as it used to be called, or high functioning autism as it used to be called, it's actually been at the thin end. And again, forgive me to talk about autism, but it's been at the thin end of the political wedge for quite a while, or that is to say, it's actually been politicized quite a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, the obverse of it as weak is, I mean, there might be still with so basically Silicon Valley is like, well, that's where all the nerds went and sort of beat us at it. I mean, I guess now there's been too many sort of burstings of the bubbles. But for a while it was like, the Asperger's people's like taking over the world, and they all live in San Fernando Valley.
Yeah, and that's also a very particular version of, and actually a quite retrograde version of autism, which is to say, you're really good at maths and, you're really nerdy and techie, which like, most of us aren't, and actually that's the only way you can be valuable. To go back to Asperger's, the eugenicist, it's the same thinking. Like in the Nazi period, he wanted to save the people that could be beneficial to society, and fuck sort of black women, autistic people, brown autistic people. They're just going to be useless. But actually, the ones that are going to enable us to be even more efficient because they're really super clever at maths, that we'll save those.
And that's still pretense. Like that's still out there, that idea, which brings me back to raising the voice for ADHD people, because we don't. I mean, there's no one saying like, oh, because the ADHD is the kid that's at that was disruptive and couldn't sit still and shouted at the back and fell off the chair, right? So that's like the idiot's neurodivergence. Like, I don't think anyone's. Although I've heard Elon Musk is ADHD, so I don't know which of us can claim him. I'm sure someone will.
Well, you can have him if you like.
I mean, no, it's fine. You can keep him.
But it's so funny, isn't it? But maybe you're right. Maybe it goes back to what you're saying, and maybe this DX project can help us think through this about the role and function, or the way in which ADHD is or is not discussed as much. I think that's a really interesting question, isn't it?
And I don't know if I'm right, but that's just my sense. I don't know whether that's just me sort of going, but what about me?
Well, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
I want to segue into the last section of our, if I may, section of our talk, which I've been excited about throughout, because it's quite a funny issue. It's fun, it's controversial, it's subject to a range of quite interesting debates. Now, the opening, what we're going to say is John Wick. Both Eva and I are huge fans of John Wick. Eva has been fortunate enough to be able to tolerate a theatre environment and go and see John Wick herself.
Yeah.
Whereas I haven't yet, but I'll probably wait till it comes on the Netflix or the Amazons or what have you before I actually see it. But Eva's seen John Wick 4, so we're not going to talk about that. And we're not really going to talk about John Wick in general. But Eva suggested to me a while ago.
It was after I sat there I was watching. It was towards the end of the film, and I'm not going to say exactly why, but I just had this light bulb moment, and I think I texted you as I came out of the cinema.
And what was that? What was your light bulb moment?
It was that John Wick is the Autistic assassin.
Okay, so John Wick as the Autistic assassin. Discuss.
Yeah.
Why do you think
Discuss.
That? By the way, to anyone who doesn't know who John Wick is portrayed by Keanu Reeves, the delicious and delightful and fragrant, I'm sure, Keanu Reeves. As he's a begrudging assassin, because someone fucks with his dog in the first one, and then he has to dust off his assassin skills and stuff. And he's a brilliant assassin. He's beautiful. He's then there's this sort of massive international organization, which weirdly enough has a lot of tattooed women as the administrators.
Yeah. They become increasingly tattooed across the film.
Yeah, they do. And then a guy pops up in the third one as well, because hitherto it's all been between women. Anyway, the point is he's an international assassin. He's very good. He seems to be the best, and he's called the ghost. No, was it not the ghost?
No,
the
Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga. Which is
the Slavic boogeyman.
Boogeyman, yeah. So he's the boogeyman of the internet, and he's very good. Anyway, but the point, and so
he's very good at killing people.
He's very good at killing people. He's very good at killing people. But there's always an ethical dimension to it. Like he's what is it like? He only kills people that are in the system, as it were.
Well, yeah, and people that are, obviously in self-defense or that sort of deserve it. And he said, he kind of will ask people not to challenge him, because he will kill them.
Yeah, he will kill them. He's got a particular set of skills. And for anyone who watches,
this is the thing.
Okay, so for anyone who watches John Wick, I'm going to destroy it for you by saying, when you watch John Wick, regard how many times Keanu Reeves goes, sure. He always goes, sure. Anyway, that's the end of that. So your thesis is...
Yeah, so special interest.
Yeah, okay, so...
It started with special interest, basically. So he's got... Which is killing.
Okay.
He's obviously, trained extremely hard, and kind of he's very
hyper-focused.
He might even try. Yeah, he's extremely hyper-focused, but he tries to not, but he can't stop himself. But it's also he obviously has kind of extremely developed senses and sensory perception, because he sort of the way
hyper empathetic or is he is he sort of sociopathic?
No, he's not, because he's got a lot of empathy. He's a kind man. He loves animals.
Yeah, but autistic people don't have empathy either.
No, where they have special kind of empathy, especially with animals, and especially in sense of right and wrong. And that's when you can see, like, he's got an extremely sort of strict code of right and wrong. And he doesn't like small talk. I mean, he's really shit at small talk. He doesn't really talk much at all in the films. Indeed. And then the final part,
which is probably a good thing. I mean, it's Keanu Reeves, so I'm not saying
the final part. And please don't destroy this, as someone else did for me, because saying that Keanu Reeves had a motorbike accident. He's got that weird autistic gait that some people, apparently autistic people have. I don't know how true that is. I can see that there's
the Auti gait.
The Auti gait. So it was just this moment of realization that John Wick was autistic, but also that only an autistic person could be John Wick. I think it goes both ways. Like that, nobody, a neurotypical person could not achieve that set of assassin skills. I think was my thesis.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm not entirely sure I agree with you. In fact, I don't. But I think it's an interesting topic. I mean, because I think that. Well, I suppose one of the things that I've been reading up on this about how we think about fictional characters, and this is apparently, and I'm new to this, so forgive me, everyone. This is apparently a big thing looking at fictional characters and diagnosing them. And in fact, it's called, as I've just discovered, headcanoning. Headcanoning. And for example, there are a lot of fans of things like, I don't know why, but Big Bang Theory, Community, which is great. And so the figure of Abed in Community apparently wasn't written as an autistic person, but he clearly has autistic traits. And the Dan Harmon sort of about Abed in Community, Dan Harmon, the creator and writer of Community, said, you know, he didn't expect it. He didn't think he was autistic, but you know, people can do that. Also, and also other figures like, well, as Eva is doing with John Wick, but also people like Sheldon Cooper, in Big Bang Theory, Sherlock Holmes being braced as autistic. And the idea is that I think people have said that it's called something like someone who moves like you, like that is to say, you see someone, that goes back to your autistic gait, I suppose, or someone who seems to reflect back to you who you are. Now, so this thing, by the way, it's called headcanoning. This article that I was reading by Krista J. Mullis, called Reflection: Autistic-Coded Characters and Fans in Fandom, it's called. I'll put up a link to this. I don't want to rip this person off, but she writes about this. She writes about this head counting, and she says that essentially these characters are autistic-coded, and I think what that means is that the characters are written with like coded autistic traits that to the writers themselves might not necessarily be explicit, or the writers deny that explicitness because, as she writes, this person writes of Dan Harmon, they don't really want to be embroiled in the controversies of representing autism.
Yes, and I recently listened to a podcast. There was a BBC one. I can send you the link and you can put it up, about neurodivergent characters in books, particularly young adult books. And they had two neurodivergent writers on who talked about their characters, and they said two very opposite things. One of them had chosen to openly call their characters autistic, and kind of identify them as such.
I think Holly Smale, is that Holly Smale?
Maybe. I think there must be several.
Yeah.
Because she wanted people, autistic people, to kind of know that this is this is someone they can identify with, whatever. Whereas the other writer said, no, I sort of deliberately didn't, and actually I was told not to, because it would sort of limit the audience, because a lot of people who identify with autistic-coded characters aren't autistic, so calling them autistic would sort of limit their accessibility. I mean, that's a very big discussion, but it's kind of interested, this idea that characters are coded, but it's almost coming back to Diagnoses, right? I mean, how many tick boxes do they sort of fulfill for? Well, and this we could all get our DSM-5 out and watch John Wick.
I mean, and this is what I mean, the sort of literary critic in me always broils at this, because essentially what we are looking at is not a character. I mean, in fiction, on the TV, it's perhaps slightly different. But if we're, for example, diagnosing Sherlock Holmes or something like that as autistic, what Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. It's just text and a page, and so therefore it's impossible to really apply a DSM criteria to a fictional character.
I'm gonna claim Sherlock Holmes for my side. He's clearly ADHD because he needs to use cocaine, i.e. stimulant, to focus, which is classic ADHD.
Okay, well, so again,
what I'm doing is I'm taking this criteria that I know is, and I'm sort of applying it, as you said, to a fictional character.
Well, let me. Sorry, go on.
No, you go.
Well, let me read. Let me read two things. One is from this Christina Mullis, who's from Hiroshima University Graduate School for International Development and Cooperation, who's written an article called "Reflection: Autistic-Coded Characters, Fans in Fandom," and she says this. Krista, I mean, they say this. For autistic fans, quote, an autistic-coded character is not merely a character they would like to be autistic or that they see a few sprinklings of autistic traits in, but one who is so obviously autistic that they must actually be autistic. At the very least, their characters were based on the idea of autism as marked by certain unusual way of thinking and being. It's therefore not far reach for autistic fans to read as autistic-coded characters who are declared autistic in the pilots of their series, blah, blah. The sentences are all over the place here, but in online autistic communities, this writer writes, fans finding and declaring characters from shows and movies and any other form of entertainment as one of their own has become quite popular. They are entire blogs dedicated to cataloguing the many characters. So this is what's called headcanoning. But so there's what this writer's saying is that there's tons of people online which I haven't seen like that are headcanoning, right? Now, that's a lot of that relates to actually TV. Now, from a fictional standpoint, there's this great article in The Guardian that I found by, again, I'll put a link to this in the show, by Shirley Dent from 2007, actually. And she writes about a preponderance. Obviously, this has been happening for a while because she writes about people writing about Jane Austen, Mr. Darcy, and his cruel, what is it, his unaccountable rudeness is a form of, in inverted commas, high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome. Their social awkwardness and frequent silences or seemingly selfish, unthinking behavior can be interpreted to the reference of the autistic spectrum. And this is a great, she says, then there's an amazing, there was a paper, a call for paper for the MLA in 2004, which was called Cognitive Disability and Textuality. And someone has written about Bartleby, like we always say, Herman Melville's character Bartleby, you know, the famous "I would prefer not to." People have written about this as suggesting autism, and this is what Dent says, and I'm sort of inclined to agree with pretty much generally what she says. She says, but at the same time, I'll say why I won't be just after this, and yet. She says, at the risk of sounding heartless, it matters not one jot to the story if Bartleby is or is not autistic. Bartleby, as much as his strangeness and remoteness engages us, is just a cipher in this story. As the title itself tells us, Bartleby the Scrivener is not the story of a man, but a story of Wall Street. This is a story about a society that alienates as much as it is a story about an individual who is alienated. And she says this last thing, and therein lies a clue as to why tales of alienation are now being interpreted as descriptions of autism. Alienation, while examining inner angst and existentialist crises, looks outward towards the individual relationship with the world and society, however confining or crossing that society may be. Jude, as in Jude the Obscure from Hardy, does not want to be obscure, and Pip does not have great expectations. Autism is a literary trope, in contrast, is about looking inwards and reducing our relationship with the world to our own unfathomable neurology, and such thinking ends in a muddle. So I think what she's saying is that it's, when you're talking about autism in particular, it's actually quite demeaning to associate autism still with unfathomability, difficulty,
and rudeness. That was what I
yes.
got immediately about Mr. Darcy's rude, so he must be autistic. I mean,
exactly. But I think things have changed since 2007. But I think Dent was touching on here in this article something which I find really troubling, about where if you are headcanoning, are you headcanoning based upon stereotypical traits of autism, which then essentially just a media perpetuating the same old traits? Like if you think about Abed, Sherlock Holmes, and Sheldon Cooper, I mean, these are really stereotypical versions of what autism is, and they're all, and okay, Abed's a Palestinian Muslim, but most of the other characters are white blokes, middle class.
Yeah.
And it's quite a dangerous thing. And but the last thing I'll say is that, because I'm really interested in, as I said, autistic poetics and what that is. But the problem is, how do you diagnose, if we take people out of the agenda, how do you diagnose writing as autistic? if it's not associated with a body or a person.
Well, let me try to unpack all of that. There's so many things there in what you've just said. First of all, let me say, for example, I totally agree that diagnosing Bartleby as autistic, that just misses the point. It kind of makes the story less interesting.
Yeah,
could totally sort of closes down the whole point of it. And I think you're also right insofar that headcanoning can be very much an exercise in stereotyping. At the same time as I acknowledge that it also is comforting and gives great joy to lots of people to identify with characters. But I think, so here I put my lit crit hat on and say, yeah, we're not in the classroom. We don't read text in order to diagnose the characters as people. That's kind of the least interesting way you can possibly read a text, I think. So then there are two questions here. Is there a way, like using, psychoanalytic literary theory, is there some kind of neurodivergent analytic theory that we can do in order to read the text through those paradigms? I guess possibly. And the other thing, what you were saying about if we take out the characters, can we diagnose the text? Can we sort of see a text blind and say this fulfills the DSM-5 criteria for neurodivergence? I don't think so. I don't think that is how the relationship between diagnosis and writing could come back, and that works. That's too simple. I think I'm trying to think on my feet here. The only thing that comes to mind is T.S. Eliot's catalyst metaphor, which I'm going to completely mangle and use for my own purposes. They kind of, a diagnosis can be a catalyst for, as you put the diagnosis into the writer's work, it sort of performs changes on that work. It doesn't necessarily mean that the work that comes out has any traces of the diagnosis, because it's just the catalyst. So it's sort of it's just something that makes a chemical reaction happen. Because I think it's kind of wrong trying to diagnose the text. I'm more interested in that. What does the catalyst do, and what's happening there, and that kind of point where diagnosis gets thrown into a writer's life or writer's work.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So essentially, to bring everything back, what you're saying here is that diagnosis, the term diagnosis and the actuality of it and the impact of it can be like a catalyzing agent to reframe something. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. And that
to reframe, to, I guess, reframe is a good word in terms of the writer's approach to language, writing, expression, representation.
Yeah, I think there are two broad things that are interrelated here that I haven't been able to. I'm not unable to disentwine, and I think that our DX project, Diagnosis project, will think about this, but I certainly will be thinking about this in my book on autistic poetics. But it's something to do with, to put it in crudely literary terms, subject and form. That is to say, if let's say we're reading a book and or we're reading a poem. A poem's an easier thing to think about, and a poem is about autism. And I've read many of these such poems, and they're saying, like, I cannot cope. It's like the sounds are too, like, let's just say someone's writing about autism as a way of exploring things. Now, that is obviously about autism. The subject is about autism. And so that there is a sense in which the writing can be, let's say it's written by an autistic person rather than someone that's pretending to be an autistic person or trying to put themselves in the mindset of an autistic person. Then that can be, the writing is symptomatic of the person writing. That is to say, they are describing the condition or representing something through language. Whereas what I'm much more interested in, is formal dimensions of language and how they are impacted by these things. And that's, to me, that's much more interesting, because it's much more, it gets more to the heart of lived experience, in the sense that we live, if to all intents and purposes, in many ways, we live through language, then of course your language is going to be affected by your neurology. And so then it's a matter of sort of categorizing or finding topologies or sketches of how those things can perhaps be extrapolated into let's say, an autistic poetics. So it seems to me that like head banging or head that's going back to my previous podcast on metal, headcanoning, and pretty much what most of the media discourse about, or mainstream media discourse and stuff about autistic characters, is all about content. And nothing to do with form.
Whereas and I think I agree with you, and that's exactly what I wanted to do with the DX project, right? That's where we're going. Is it's not, I'm not going to say it's not about content. It's not just about content. It's about more than, it's about how form gets changed, how language gets changed, but also how practice gets changed, how experience gets changed. For me, there's sort of a peripheral thing that I'm also interested in, as well as the poetics. I guess, I mean, the question is, could one see the different, is this sort of really crude way of saying, could you see a difference between the autistic person writing the right poem about autism, or the neurotypical person writing the same poem, is there something that is non-reproducible, but by the experience of having a diagnosis? But of course, then the question is it the condition which changes us, or the diagnosis? Or where does the diagnosis come into where the condition?
Well, that's a really interesting thought process, like thought experiment, isn't it? Like, in a kind of Borgian way, that sense in which if an autistic person wrote the same poem pre and post diagnosis, would that change the nature of the language itself, or would it be exactly the same? And arguably, the language would change even if the language didn't change, because the inflection. So it's a really
because the diagnosis is there. It's already something in relation to which that language is going to stand.
Right? And I think, but I think that at the end of it, into this sort of formal pursuit, which is again something that we'll be looking at and thinking about in the DX and writing thing, but also in my book, it's an open-ended thing. I mean, there's no way in which one is going to come up with a taxonomy of autistic poetics, as it were, or a taxonomy of neurodivergent poetics, because it would be undermined the next time an autistic person wrote. But there must be, and the structuralist in me like really desperately wants there to be a taxonomy anyway, because that's kind of interesting.
The Auti structuralist in you.
Exactly. There has to be, and it's like there has to be something at the end of the rainbow, which is to say, I have cracked the code of it. But in a way, it's the pursuit that is interesting, which goes back to the notion of writing, like the Writing and Diagnosis project, is that actually one of the ways to think through or about diagnosis is by the processes of writing, which is again open-ended. It is an epistemological thing which has no teleology. It's like it's just going on and on, or cripistemology, as someone else said. It's really hard to say, cripistemology.
I'm not even going to try.
So in a sense, we are, anyone who's writing in this field or thinking about this field essentially are just opening up questions rather than answering any questions. But the productivity of opening up the questions is much better than not opening them up at all, I suppose.
But always, I mean, that's kind of what we do as academics. I'm on the questioning. I like asking questions. I don't necessarily need the answers. And with the DX project, like, I want to open it up. So I hope it goes in directions as well that we have not just seen. I'd like to see answers that I haven't sort of expected. Well, answers, that sounds like we are, responses. And also, like, I'm hoping to get some multimodal stuff, like it reflecting on does reflecting on writing always have to be in writing?
Yeah. Or of course, yeah, and of course it needs to be. Well, I think we have thought about this, but need to think about it more in terms of accessibility and non-verbal representation, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's so. Just to reiterate, I'll put a link, but this has become like a sort of a big advert for our project, but that's okay because it's my podcast and I'm not in the hock to anyone, and no one listens anyway, so it's fine. But
if you are listening,
please check out our thing, DX Diagnosis and Writing. I'll put a link to our website, and if you're interested, please submit something. We put up a number of Nia and I put up a number of things that you might want to explore, so we'd be really interested in hearing from you. The deadline for that, by the way, is the 1st of July 2023, which may be subject to sort of flexibility, but just get in touch with us.
Yeah, this is ongoing as well, so if you're sort of not at all possible to think of this now, kind of keep checking back. You can sign up on the website to get email update. Because this is going to hopefully be ongoing, fingers crossed, if enough people are interested, to keep the discussion going.
Yeah, okay, so I think we'll end it there, Eva, if you don't mind.
Okay.
That was a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Just so this is the end of Gareth Whimbox 8 on Diagnosis, and just to remind you, my guest was Eva Aldea, the writer, and newly found ADHD.
Yeah.
The foundling ADHD, the
baby
ADHD. But yeah, so just to say thank you, and join me next time on Gareth's Whimbox. That was Gareth Whimbox, episode 8 on Diagnoses. And yes, I very much look forward to seeing you at our next Whimbox. And subject to be decided, but it should be in a week or so. So thank you again for listening, and take care.